Good evening and welcome to this City Talks Forum, jointly hosted by the University of Tasmania and City of Hobart. I'm Rufus Black. I'll be your Master of Ceremonies this evening. Before we begin, the University and the City wish to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people of this area, Nipaluna, Hobart, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to recognise the Lord Mayor of Hobart, Councillor Reynolds, who joins us this evening and will provide some closing remarks. To our guests, a very warm welcome. Our principal guest speaker this evening, Greg Vann, Director of Ethos Urban, and to our expert panel. Stephen Burgess, engineer and urban strategist, author, Alan Witte, principal and partner at SSG Economics and Planning, and Jason Byrne, Professor of Human Geography and Planning here at the University. City Talks Hobart is a new series of public forums which aim to inspire ideas and innovation for Hobart's future through a series of webinars and public talks. These conversations will focus on how we as a community can build back better after COVID-19. As this is a webinar, just a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Microphones and cameras and chat functions and raised hand functions have been disabled so that our speakers can proceed uninterrupted, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A function. You can ask questions anonymously, and a selection of those will be moderated towards the end of the discussion. We've also got some audience polls to get a flavour about how people are seeing things as we go along. And finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on YouTube and SoundCloud channels. But to tonight's topic, it's certainly one that seems very timely indeed, as conversation in the city and in our media are so focused on these questions of Hobart's traffic congestion, future livability, plans to increase housing affordability, and more broadly, how the city moves itself forward. And so I hope this afternoon does provide some stimulus to those conversations by bringing a range of expert perspectives to help us as a city think and deepen that conversation about where we really want the city to be going. Cities, I think, all around the world are coming out of this pandemic, and some still very much in it are asking questions about what the future looks like and what they've discovered about their neighbours and their neighbourhoods, how much they value them, and how we can look after them better and evolve our cities around the things that we've learnt that we value in these times, but also the things we know need to change. And so to get our conversations underway, let me introduce our guest speaker. Greg Vann is a qualified in planning and economics and has been at the forefront of planning in Queensland specifically, but more broadly in Australia for over 40 years. And he's a consultant, and having previously worked in local and state governments. He's one of Australia's best known and leading planners and a well-known advocate for better cities. Greg was project director for Shaping SEQ, the 2017 regional plan for Southeast Queensland, chaired the state's transit-oriented development task force, co-authored the Next Generation Planning Handbook, is a life fellow and former president and national councillor of the Planning Institute of Australia. I'll now hand over to Greg to share with us some insights into how Hobart can address its growing pains and make some smart choices for the future. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much, Vice-Chancellor Rufus, and thanks to the University of Tasmania and to the Lord Mayor, Anna Reynolds, and the City of Hobart for having me along today. I hope my contribution will at least provoke some thinking and some discussions. So just going straight on to my first slide, I just want to go through what I'll cover here tonight. So just one by one, quickly, first point is, I think Hobart growth is upon you. Your future is a lot different to your past in terms of challenges. Second one, let's have a look at some of the COVID-19 matters that the Vice-Chancellor mentioned or at least referred to. Then we'll have a quick look at some of the impacts of sprawl, some of the smart moves that we can take on to the next point there, the smart moves that might be things that Hobart could be thinking about doing now. And then what does that all mean for you, for Hobart? So, coming from someone from outside, I do go to Hobart regularly. So I guess I've got a history with the place, but I don't know it as well as perhaps some of the other speakers. But anyway, let's get stuck into it. So the next thing I want to say is your secret is out, Hobart. You've been discovered by the world. Everyone knows what a good thing you've got going on down there. You've been discovered. Now, this started to happen. I think Hobart for some years has been a small city punching above its weight in terms of its livability, its urbanity. The physical setting is spectacular, and people have started to realise that it was affordable and a great place to live. And COVID has really amped that up. So you're going to be facing different challenges in the future. So to the next slide, I just want to talk a bit about a few COVID trends. I just want to hit up front. This little diagram is one from California, YIMBY. People think that COVID-19 is caused by density. It's not. It's COVID. It's caused by overcrowding. The difference is density is not about how many people are in a building. Overcrowding is the problem where there are many people in one space, like a home or an abattoir or a nursing home and so on. That's where the big issues have really come out in cities. So I just wanted to say up front, density is not actually an issue from a COVID perspective. So moving along to some of the key trends, working from home, we probably all know and experience, that's with us to stay. All the data is showing that most people are going to choose to work from home at least part of the time where they have the option to do so. Next one is, so our behaviours and lifestyles are changing. We're starting to spend more time in our local areas because we were forced to, and understand those local areas and value them better. The next one was, we've been starting to remake our streets in many places around the world, repurposing, bike lanes, streets in Brooklyn, New York being taken over for people to, eat outside and so on. So that's something that's really starting to happen. The local economy, the focus on local has been really strong. And I think people have felt a real allegiance to their local centre to want to support them. The next one I want to touch on quickly, just city centres have been challenged in some respects because everyone working from home, not as many people in the city centre. That one's still a work in progress, I reckon. The next one was from little things, big things grow. This is an opportunity for governments at all levels to do programs of small things, footpath improvements, more street trees, better parks, etc., rather than try and build one big new thing, which is a bit of a tendency sometimes. And the last one is, I just wanted to go on to this. I often say local is the new black. We've sort of discovered local as the place that a lot of people want to hang out. This is really important, I think, going forward from COVID-19. So a couple of points to make here. So there is a real renewed focus on health and well-being. I think COVID has caused many people to actually think, is this the life I want to lead? And is this what I want to get out of life? And local centres are a key place for that. And those lifestyle choices are driving real estate markets. We're seeing it in Hobart, but we're seeing it in many regional cities. We're seeing it in country areas, sea changes, tree changes, big things at work. Next point is this boom in local tourism. And I'm a Queenslander, and I reckon every second person I know in Queensland is either in or has been in Tassie in the last month or three. The next one is people are living and using spaces differently for the reasons I've sort of outlined above. That people in cities are turning to active transport throughout the world. You're seeing a lot more biking, but the other thing is walking. If you can live near a local centre or live near where you work and you can walk, people really value that lifestyle. There is concern about taking public transport. And the next one, people are getting back into their cars. So traffic in most places is back to pre-COVID levels or even beyond. The one that's really important for Hobart is the regional cities boom. You are taking off and you need to do things differently. So next slide, So this is why this topic is so on point and why I was interested in contributing. So there's just a few points I want to make here. I think there's an opportunity for Hobart to avoid some of the mistakes that other cities have made, to fast forward to a better future and sort of not have some of the problems that have been raised by trying to deal with rapid growth in other parts of Australia and for that matter, the world. So go straight towards harnessing growth towards a great city. So I think that's the opportunity here. The key variables in this equation are housing and transport, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those. And so I think the theme is really, really apt. And I just want to say one point before I get on to the detail. Next one point there is this is not an either or conversation. People tend to think when you start talking about housing that you're trying to get everyone out of their traditional detached house and into high rise. In fact, it's the stuff in between that's most important, so the high rise in most areas doesn't do a lot of the accommodation of more people. It's actually all the other things, and I'll talk a bit about that. Same with transport. It's not about trying to get everyone out of a car onto a bus. It's giving people genuine choices. So next slide. So the impacts of sprawl, I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. Sprawl, that stuff on the left-hand side, there's an organisation called Strong Towns in the US. I'd recommend you have a read of this if you're interested. They call the sort of the second half of the 20th century experimentation with suburban development a Ponzi scheme, one that will collapse under its own weight because we can't afford to continue to do it. And the one on the right is one of many different infographics that you'll see that shows you the relative costs of how we travel around. So driving is actually very expensive for society. Buses not so much. Biking and walking are actually good. You're actually ahead financially as a society if you can do it. So the next slide is about just understanding just what the impacts of slide has had. Blobonomics is a term I coined. I think it's a very technical sounding term. I really, really like it. No, these are 4 cities. That's somewhere after the Second World War. That's the size of their urban area at the same scale for each of these cities, and that's what it looks like 60 years later. Go back again and we'll just look at that twice. So that's what they were, that's what they are now. Let's go to the next one. You can just see the massive expansion. In most cases it took them 100 years or two to get to the first little blob, and massive expansion from the late from 2050 on. So it's an extraordinary time. One of the impacts of sprawl is about how fair our societies are. These maps are mapping, it comes from Griffith University in Queensland, what was called a vampire index, fancy name, but basically it's just showing the risk of households to movements in interest rates and petrol prices, as in how expensive is the housing and how expensive is your travel, and what risk you are at a household of being able to not be able to afford it. The one on the left is Southeast Queensland. Green is good, light green is not so good. The other colours are the places where the households are highly vulnerable to these moves. The one on the right-hand side is Hobart, and you can see a similar pattern. In or near the city centre in the major employment areas, pretty good. The rest are areas where there are challenges for people living in those areas to be able to afford the lifestyle and the travel that goes with it. So next slide. I just want to talk a little bit about housing. Just click a couple of the housing is not one size fit all. And I talked to this earlier. You'll see the diagram at the bottom of the screen there. That was done by a fellow called Daniel Perolik in San Francisco, called the missing middle. So the stuff on the left-hand side is your traditional detached houses on a block of land. Stuff on the right-hand side is your more sort of higher rise. Everything in the middle goes from flats over your garage to small duplexes to 3-story walk-ups and a whole lot of types of mixture of housing. That's where you can actually do the heavy lifting. Why do we do this? Because households aren't what they used to be. Households are now quite different. Some years ago, households were mostly two parents, 2 kids, or some variation thereof. Now that's about a third of all households. There are so many households, single people, 2 people, blended households of several generations living together, and a whole range of households. So our demographics are quite different, yet we're still trying to build housing that was designed for your traditional family. So what the missing middle is a few things. local housing choice for everyone. Everyone being able to make a choice that suits their housing needs in their local area. The second one is about giving people genuine choice. The third one is about variety, different types of housing, shapes, number of bedrooms, etc., and therefore cost, and a range of options for different budgets. I think the last point is it's important to well-planned communities. Getting this right is really vital, I think, to the future of Hobart as it looks to accommodate its population growth. So I think the key word in all of that is choice. If you're only producing one form of housing and using one form of transport, you're actually not giving people choice because you're forcing them to live in a certain way and use certain transport. So this is really about the key to a well-planned city is choice. Next slide. Little bit about transport. It's actually a space problem. Transport is really, driving is the hardest way to move a lot of people through a given space. And these are just some figures. There's different versions of this. This is pretty typical, but somewhere around about 1,500 people per hour can use one lane of traffic. If that's, if you skip down a bit to a dedicated transit lane, that can be 4,000 or 8,000 people. If it's a sidewalk, it can be 9,000 people. So you can get a lot more people through one space if you're using modes differently. I love these two cartoons by Andy Singer from the US. What people think driving is like in the top, the myth, and what the reality is for most of us sitting in traffic. So moving on. So I want to also talk a little bit about parking. People think parking is free, but it's not. It has a tremendous cost. There's a fellow called Donald Shoup, S-H-O-U-P, wrote a book called The High Cost of Free Parking. Free parking actually just encourages car use. The more parking you have, the more people will drive. It costs, according to him, the urban economies of US cities overall, many hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and car parks actually have, each car park has a cost. And what's more, parking, particularly on streets, makes walking and biking less pleasant or feasible. And so right across the US and North America now, communities are abolishing parking requirements. They're actually saying, we don't want as much parking as we've got. And so that's where parking's heading. It's not free, it costs. It adds a lot, about, somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 to the cost of a unit or a townhouse, every car park you put in there. So just moving on, just starting to pull this all together. What does it mean for Hobart? So Hobart has choices it didn't used to. Hobart is going to deal with a lot more growth in the future than it has in the past. This gives it great opportunities. In having worked in Southeast Queensland for 40 years, one thing growth does allow you to do is you can change things pretty quickly because there's a lot happening. So you can skip the problematic growth of trying to do everything by suburban developments that has to go further and further out and build freeways to get them all to where they need to go. I reckon Hobart can skip that and can do it in its own Hobart style. So you do it in a way that suits you as a place. I think just next point, the key to this, if there's one good thing you need to do to make a great city, it's provide people with real choices in housing and transport. If you take one thing out of this presentation, that's the one I'd love you to take home. And that creates better outcomes for everyone, not just for those who can afford to live in the places they'd like to live in today. You want everyone to be able to do that. And I think that just about wraps it up for me. So thank you. I hope that's given us enough time for a good discussion, Rufus.
No, that's terrific. Greg. So we'll get into the discussion. We've got a question that's come in the Q&A that I might use to kick off, which is, these are great ideas, but how do we counter the forces of those who actually work in the opposite direction, who are economically interested in actually driving sprawl because they don't pay for all of the side effects that causes? And after you've come to that, Ellen, I might also turn to you on this it's a question of city governance in lots of ways. But Greg, how do we get the balance of forces right to get these outcomes?
Well, the first thing you do is start having conversations like these, Rufus, and I really think it's a great thing to see Hobart doing this because these ultimately, the developers and government will follow where the actual demand is and what people want. At the moment, we're used to this 2 or 3 generations of everyone doing it a certain way. Doesn't mean that it always has to be like that. Government has choices, and the government in the end is leading some of these things. My experience, I would say a few things. Pilot projects are really important. Do demonstration projects, models of different types of housing in different locations. Do experiment with, there's a thing called tactical urbanism. You just have a go at something, you do it lightly, quickly, and you build it. If it doesn't work, you take it out. But the history of this is that it never gets taken out because it does work once you start to change some of these things up. So there's a few thoughts to get started.
Great. Well, I might, Ellen, turn to you, because we've also got a bit of a challenge in Hobart is these questions span local government areas. And, that's not something that's going to change anytime soon. But how do we deal with the kind of governance challenge of managing a picture like Hobart, Scott?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a great question, I believe. And I think there's probably 3 points I'd like to raise around that point is really to achieve a more consolidated pattern of urban growth with slightly higher densities than you would get with sprawl. You need to get that balance right between greenfield and infill, and you actually need to make infill a bit more attractive comparable to greenfield. Now, how do you do that? And I think there are probably 3 key things, and actually, well, there are a few more, but I'll stick to the 3. First of all, there's of course the idea around how do you make sure there is a land for infill development available? So often infill development, there's lots of little fragmented pieces of land, light industrial. There's probably lots of opportunities along the Northern Transit Corridor in Hobart towards Glenorchy. There's, of course, a lot of hoarding of land going on. Lots of little owners have a lot of land and just wait until they get the highest return before they sell it. That all pushes up the development costs. So a key vehicle, what you need, and Tasmania does not have that, unlike all the other states and territories in Australia, is a government-owned land development organization. So that's an organization that buys up land, amalgamates little parcels to development-ready sites, de-risks that somewhat for the development sector, and also makes sure that there is a pipeline of projects available for the development sector. And that makes it also a bit more attractive to developers to not just go the good old greenfield, same sort of development, but actually start to think about how you can build a better city. So that's really around that point. And of course, there's a great site available in Hobart over the next 20 years. Once the university starts to slowly move into the city, the Sandy Bay campus might really be a great pilot site for that sort of development. Another key thing, and that's really around indeed the governance, is to fix that planning system. There are key corridors and nodes in a city that you really need to plan very well to create those higher densities that you can enable transit and public transport. And for that, there really is a need for a regional planning authority. So for some of the sites around key corridors and nodes, you might have to move some of the planning authority away from the local council into a regional planning authority. Importantly, that authority does need a democratic mandate, of course. So such a authority would be led, for instance, by the mayors of the key councils in Greater Hobart, and they can make those city shaping decisions for the next 20 years and take it away from sometimes a little local discussions into a higher level strategic thinking. And the last very important point is how do you get the community along? And I really liked in one of the slides you shared, Greg, that term YIMBY. So we often have to deal with not in my backyard, NIMBY responses when there's higher densities. So how do you create a YIMBY? Yes, in my backyard. backyard sort of response. The key thing there is you can start thinking once you start increasing densities in areas, you have land value uplift. And making sure that you share some of that value created with the community. So it's important to set up a community contract and make sure that, for instance, 50% of the value uplift is reinvested in the local community into public open space, public transit, and community infrastructure such as libraries and recreational things to go to. And that makes sure that the higher density comes with a great benefit to the community, which is a more livable and a more enjoyable community. And I'll probably leave that at this point.
Rufus, might I be able to make?
Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, thanks. That was great, Alan. The one thing I was just going to comment on is that the question of governance, a regional planning authority is one model. The model that's been used in Southeast Queensland is actually a collaborative model which has ultimately legislative teeth. So the regional planning is done by the state government in partnership with all of the local governments in Southeast Queensland. That's taken us a long time to get there, but that's actually worked pretty well. So there are different types of models, but essentially you need some effective means of regional coordination if you're going to deal with Greater Hobart as a city to tackle some of these problems.
So I might come to a question here, which is really almost a definitional one. And Jason, I might turn to you on this one. Where actually is the boundary that we talk about sprawl? So when we're thinking about how to think about Hobart's boundaries for the purpose of this discussion, we've got an observation here. You know, there's a lot of developments that you could do within a 15-kilometre radius. How should we think about this question of boundaries, Jason, so that we know what we're talking about even here?
That's a really great question, Rufus. And the image that's behind all of us shows how precious some of the landscapes are that we have here in Tasmania. I noticed some of the chat was around boundaries. We want to preserve those beautiful hillsides and green space that give the city such amazing character. We don't want to become like the Bay Area in San Francisco that's overrun the surrounding landscape and sprawls out forever. So to answer your question simply though, we already have a boundary in our planning strategies here. We have an urban growth boundary, much like Southeast Queensland has an urban footprint. And there's plenty of space within that urban growth boundary for development, very close to the city centre. So that's not what we would consider to be sprawl in that sort of 15-kilometre area that encompasses much of that growth boundary. The catch, as Ellen has said, is ensuring that the densities are appropriate. So if I might just indulge quickly, I can show you and everybody here, Rufus, the land information system of Tasmania.
Great, thanks.
And on here we can see densities mapped from the 2016 census. And you can see quite high densities, not the same sorts of densities we'd see in Sydney or Melbourne, apart from maybe around Battery Point, but very low densities as we move out into the greater Hobart area and sprawling outwards when we can in fact increase densities in very close proximity to the city centre. So that vehicle that we have in the Southern Tasmanian Regional Land Use Strategy already gives us the architecture that Ellen and Greg were pointing to. And indeed, we have a Southern Tasmanian Councils Authority, which might help us better plan for Greater Hobart. But as Stephen knows, that regional planning instrument, the Southern Tasmanian Regional Land Use Strategy, is very out of date at the moment.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jason. I might actually turn to you, Stephen, a question that was tagged to Greg, but I think you kind of, given the work you do, have a great response to this. The question is, given that Tasmanians are notoriously emotionally attached to their ability to park in the city centre, a common topic on Talkback Radio, what do you suggest local and state government can do to impact community views around change, density and development, which are not widely liked?
Not widely liked, that's an interesting way to put it. Well, Greg touched on it in his presentation. Is one of the things that we sort of don't quite understand about parking is how much it costs. So, and so we create this artificial demand as if the government pays most of the costs, which they do, then you have an artificial demand for parking. If we had to pay the full cost of parking, we would find another way to do it. So we created this artificial demand, which drives people off the bus. It stops people shopping in their local centre. It stops people walking. It stops people driving. And this is a result of oversupply of road space and an oversupply of parking space, which then in turn promotes this urban sprawl, as in once you get past 15 or 6 kilometres from the city, the cost to the community of developing out there escalates just astronomically. So by the time we get to Huonville or Sorell, as a community, we're paying $80,000, $90,000 extra per block to get that block to the market, because we've got to build all that infrastructure. And that all sort of gets on that hamster wheel. As if we keep providing car infrastructure, then we keep creating opportunity, we create an artificial demand, which normally the market couldn't sustain, but because we pump so much government money into artificializing that demand, then we get on this really bad hamster wheel. And the thing to do would be, instead of creating urban growth boundaries, saying, look, you've got to develop here and you've got to develop there, do what they've done in Southeast Queensland. And no model's perfect, but it's just the most recent one probably, and it kind of works okay, is do a proper infrastructure charging regime so that the people who incur the costs pay the costs, and we get a more equitable picture of demand, so that people are saying, oh, look, it's more expensive to live out there than you think. Why don't we look at, and so then, there's, developers are always going to go out there, sprawl, because they can make money, but that's only because the model's a little bit broken and we've created artificial demand. If we had a proper demand model where people paid proper costs, developers would be coming back into that urban corridor. And Ellen talked about the great places where they could go. Kingston Town Centre, Bellerive Village Centre, the Northern Growth Corridor, Glenorchy. These would be great places to develop, to live, to catch the tram, to catch the ferry. And this is why we don't have any of this public transport infrastructure, because all the money is getting spent on infrastructure, making sure that someone can drive from Huonville or Sorell to get to work. So, you have to decide what sort of city you want and start moving forward. And that might mean that I'm going to take half a dozen car parks down, do a beautiful wide footpath, have some great street trees so these businesses in here can prosper, attract more people to the CBD. That could be something I'm prepared to sacrifice to get a great, livable, exciting, healthy, happy city.
Rufus, I had a couple of comments on that one quickly.
Please jump in, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just two things. I mean, I think what we actually wrote into the regional plan for Southeast Queensland, the concept of affordable living as opposed to affordable housing, because if you just look at the cost of housing, of course, the further out you go, the cheaper it's going to get. But no one really factors in the true cost of the transport that comes with that housing choice. And if you put the two together, the two big household expenses are housing and transport. And so we really have to rethink how we're pricing things so that the price signal actually does work in the marketplace. So I think that's a really good point that Stephen's making there.
So in this kind of territory about kind of equitable, affordable housing, we've got a question in here, which is about if we're going to do this infill higher density housing, how do we make sure that it's actually affordable so that we can have cities populated by the full cross-section of our community, not just housing that ends up continuing to exaggerate the differences that Greg, you showed so clearly on that map. Jason, I might turn to you on this one.
Thank you, Rufus, and I'm sure other panel members could jump in here as well. There's a lot of expertise on the panel. As I mentioned in a recent Mercury, and as Greg has highlighted, this is about choice. So there's not too many people who would weigh up paying $650,000 for a new apartment, two-bedroom apartment in the middle of the city compared to the cost of a house at $350,000, $400,000 out the railway and go, yeah, I'm going to move into the middle of the city. So what we need to do is provide real choice, not the kind of extremes that we have at the moment. And that real choice, and again, I'll just share an image for the benefit of the audience, might look at something like this. And this is not being prescriptive, it's just to show people what some of that choice looks like. If we look around our older parts of Hobart, we can see that there were plenty of workers' cottages and terraces and small townhouses that sustained a really vibrant and effective tram network. In fact, in Hobart and Launceston, we had the first tram networks in the Southern Hemisphere, which shows it can be done, right? If we look back in history, we can see that the housing mix and the choices enable us to make public transport work. At the moment, it's a bit like what Greg said and Stephen, people into these artificial models. So I think the secret is in providing choice, allowing people to age in place, for example, by building underneath their house in a garage, converting that into a studio space, and then they could rent out or sell the space above to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford in the middle suburbs.
Great, thanks, Jason. Ella, I might turn to you. There are a number of questions have come through really about how do we use various kind of economic instruments to help incent the right behaviours? What are the land, should we think about land taxes differently, transport charges? What counsel would you give us around where we should be focusing those conversations? Because they're always politically very tricky. Somebody ends up paying more in one way or another often with these things. Where should we be thinking around the most effective economic instruments to help achieve this kind of picture?
Yeah, thanks. Again, it comes to that balance between greenfield and infill, and trying to change the balance towards infill in terms of cost as well. So at the moment in Tasmania, we don't really have a solid development contribution system. So whenever housing is built in greenfield areas, the true cost of provisioning infrastructure and services to those blocks are actually not being charged. So that's basically a windfall towards greenfield development, and that's something that you don't see back in the infill area. So one, of course, is then you need to start charging, and I think Stephen already made that point as well, you need to start charging the real cost of greenfield development as a first point. Another key thing, and that's somewhat economic, but that also refers to, I guess, for instance, a government-owned land organization, is that de-risking and amalgamating redevelopment sites so that it becomes more attractive and affordable for developers to deliver a mix of housing in those sites. And that is, of course, then you can deliver some affordable housing. And some of the funding can actually come from the densification itself. So I mentioned before that value sharing. So whenever you, in a planning system, for instance, allow a greater density, you increase the development rights and the possible profits a developer could make on that site. And rather than just giving out those development rights for free, as a planning authority, you can say, no, actually, we would like please at least 50% back of that, because we want to make this a very attractive a livable community, and then you can reinvest that sort of money from the value uplift in social and affordable housing. So you can actually subsidize certain types of housing to make sure that all types of households have a place in the city, and also you can reinvest that into other types of infrastructure. So those are some of the mechanisms that you can use to really shift that balance and make that infill development more attractive.
In terms of making that infill development attractive, a question here that I think speaks to something people often worry about. And Greg, I might direct this to you. Perhaps Stephen, you might have a take on this as well. How can you increase infill housing without blocking sunlight and views of neighbours? Privacy also disappears once you're surrounded by multi-storey buildings. This is not a pleasant situation or enjoyable. I think this is something people really worry about. How do we speak to that so we get more sort of support from the people who already live in these areas to see this change? Greg, perhaps then Stephen, interested in your takes on how we get people behind this.
Yeah, thanks, Rufus. A couple of points. The first thing is to break down, as I said in the presentation, the idea that the density is always going to be tall buildings. Because a lot of the sort of missing middle housing options are 2 and 3 story, not 5 and 10 and 50, whatever. But the key piece here is design. It's really about the higher the density, the more important design comes, and you need to have metrics around setbacks, ensuring it's not overlooking, ensuring access to at the right sort of atmosphere, climate conditions and so on. So there are models for all these things in different parts of the world. The important thing is to have good rules and stick to them.
Stephen, any thoughts on how we get people behind this?
Yeah, look, very similar. And look, and once again, this density issue, like Hobart is relatively low density. And look, I'm pretty sure you could, if you just filled up all the first floor vacancies around Hobart CBD, you've probably got our next 5 years growth covered. And that doesn't block anyone's sunlight or view or whatever. So we've got to start thinking about, we've got all these great assets of, there's 2- and 3-story light industrial development all through, that Northern Transons Core Corridor that Ellen mentioned. There's potential for a great, 60 dwelling per hectare village over at Bellerive, and I could cram in there and no one would even notice they're there. No one would miss out on sunlight. It would be a great, walkable, vibrant, healthy, happy community. We could finally get a ferry if you move some more people over there. There's so many more discussions to have and say, oh, look, if someone builds a 90-story building, I'm going to miss out on sunlight. That is not what we're talking about here. You could pour so much sand in between the rocks here and make this city so much more vibrant, and people wouldn't miss out on a damn thing. They would just be happier.
And Rufus, this goes to the affordability issue too. You do need to understand the land economics behind development to actually understand how you do your settings for what sort of development goes where. But fundamentally, the problem of inner city living is scarcity of opportunity, which drives up the market. So The more missing middle development we have, the more housing supply there is in walkable locations, the cheaper it will get. So it's a supply and demand thing. In the US, housing, walkable communities, newly built walkable communities command a premium in the market, but they only do that because there's a scarcity of them. So there is a market demand thing here that we need to get your heads around.
And the point there about where you restrict opportunity is actually very valid. But when they did, the Unity Plan, when they put together Auckland, which is quite a famous story, which we won't have time to get into, but the most crippling growth boundary they put on Auckland before they fixed it wasn't horizontal, it was vertical. And that's what ruined housing prices there, because they stopped people, doing this, and they forced them all to the edge, and the economics of that almost ruined the city. So, having the growth boundary is not only horizontal, it can be vertical, and that vertical growth boundary can be quite crippling.
Great. Jason, are you wanting to come in here?
Well, I just think, Rufus, picking up a point that the other panelists have made, the East Perth redevelopment in Western Australia was a classic example of what Ellen has pointed to, where the government took former industrial land, quite blighted land, remediated it, and then showed the development industry what was possible. It took the government to step in, much like after the Second World War, when we had the small homes designs that were made freely available to people, and to show what was possible, to absorb some of that risk initially and show the development sector, this can work. Here's some examples. This is what opportunity and choice looks like. And to also, as Ellen said, provide for people who otherwise would not be able to afford to live in these locations by giving affordable housing choices and matching those to people's spending capabilities.
And there are examples of that in every Australian city, Rufus. The Lightsview in Adelaide, Bowden Village there, the inner northeast in Brisbane, where the governments took a lead and showed how housing innovation can happen. And once they do that, the market there's a market for it. And then, of course, the private sector wants to be in on that market. So government leadership is really important here.
Ellen, you wanting to come in here?
Yeah, just indeed on the point of government leadership, I think, and I was thinking also about the role of transport and public transport. And that's, of course, an area that's really underutilized in Hobart. And we've got this great Northern Transit Corridor. And in order for public transport investment to be viable and have good returns, you need density, and vice versa. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing between public transport infrastructure investment and higher density investment. And I think, again, the government could really take a leading role by putting in some investment in that northern transit corridor in terms of public transit, and then automatically you all will see that the market start responding by increasing those densities around key nodes along that corridor, especially also, of course, if there's some work done about underutilized light industrial land and making that available for mixed use and residential development.
One of the themes that's sort of running through a number of the questions here is right in the territory you've just been in, Ellen, which is around how do we get the public transport working better? There's a broad consensus that it's pretty hopeless, and that's and people have said that for quite a while, but nothing's happened. Where, Ellen, do we start on this that will start to really create some momentum? Where do cities begin? And then I'll get round the panel for some views on how we really get at this topic, because we're not going to get this sorted without some bit of a revolution, I think. So, Ellen, where do cities start when they've got a bit stuck and not getting public transport revved up properly?
Yeah, I agree. It's again, it also starts, of course, I already made the point around having some leadership at government level of actually putting in infrastructure. It's also around starting this conversation. I just, when I moved to Hobart or Southern Tasmania 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I know, the time flies. I just noticed how unpopular public transport was, and the whole stigma nearly around the use of the bus, and that it was nearly for people of who are really poorly off, that only they would use public transport. So it's really also that conversation about that it's actually it should be the preferred way to get around, and opening up all that. So it's partially that conversation and partially of that forward investment. And we've got, of course, that wonderful opportunity there in the transit corridor, and also trying to not get wedded to one type of transport, because I think so far there's been quite a bit of focus that certain leaders were very interested in just light rail, which can be quite expensive, and in the intermediate time there are probably other types of transit that may work very well and are not that expensive, and then slowly you can build on getting the densities and the demand there, and then build up the types of public transit that you offer over time.
That's great. Stephen, you want to come in here? What are we going to do? This, I mean, when I get on a bike, it's like entering the kill zone in the city, and I hate that because I'm so used to cities where you can cycle and it's part of life. What are we going to do?
Oh, look, Ellen sort of alluded to the fact that you get into this thing, it's a chicken and egg. Should I put on the transport first and take away the road space and then get the density? But in that whole process, parking space and road space is actually the rooster. That starts the whole chicken and egg thing. The oversupply of road space and car parking space mucks everything. Now, rightly so, people in Hobart, unless you live perhaps on the main road corridor, you've got a relatively unreliable, infrequent bus service, and that's because that's all the money that's been invested into it. The poor old Hobart City Council subsidised CBD parking to the tune of millions of dollars a year. Glenorchy and Kingston and Clarence, they don't even charge for this. They're giving away tens of millions of dollars of valuable urban real estate for free, but then they say, but you should, instead of using up this free stuff that I'm giving you, you should pay money and catch the bus. It's a ludicrous proposition. How's anyone going to change modes when every single budget source, every single economic signal we're sending to the community is, look, you can pay to catch the bus, or you can use all this free stuff that we're giving you. But you can't. We have to make a decision of what sort of city you want. The happy, healthy cities, and Greg alluded to the fact that before, small cities, the new black people are looking all over the place and saying, I don't have to live in Sydney and Melbourne anywhere. I can live wherever I want. They want to live in a cool city. And if you're throwing all your money at road space and at car parking space, you're not going to end up being one of those cool cities. People want to be able to jump on some sort of PT. They want to be able to walk. They want to be able to ride their bike safely. So your budget, your investment has got to reflect on that to say, look, we're making a sustainable city. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be livable. It's going to be clean, green, safe, happy, and healthy.
Jason, I'm going to come to you on this. I mean, you did some great work with the RACT. I mean, it tells you how bad things are when the car organisation is advocating for public transport. I don't know a city in the world like that. But look, you've done some work with them and thought a lot about this. Where do we, but it's stuck. Where do we go next?
So I think you hit the nail on the head, Rufus. The RACT is a peak car body advocating for walkability, active cities, and public transport. And you kind of scratch your head and go, what? Well, they're doing leadership. They're doing real leadership. This is what leadership looks like. And the reason they do this is they know that people don't want to be stuck in gridlock traffic if they don't need to be. Why do we force people into cars and deny them choice? You know, it's actually morally reprehensible what we're doing in Hobart. And we can look at this through what's called the Jedi principle. So not Star Wars, but justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we've got a lot of vulnerable, marginalised people who have zero choice, who are stuck in that vampire model, paying very high costs to live out on the outskirts of the city, where in fact they could be in the inner city, walking, cycling, being fit and healthy. So we need government leadership here. And if we had government really seriously invest in good quality public transport, and it need not be a massive light rail. We can start simple, right? Safe failure, small experiments, hydrogen powered buses, electric powered buses, bus rapid transit, build up the ridership, build up the densities, and then if you need later on, you can switch to other modes like light rail. But we can do this, right? That San Francisco was the size of Hobart now, of Greater Hobart, when it put in its Muni system, its revolutionary, world-class municipal public transport system. We can do it. It just requires leadership.
I wanted to do two things on that, Rufus. I'm preempting you. I hope that's okay.
No, go for it. And we'll be closing with your observations here. So anything you want to wrap up would be...
Well, I just want to say two things about this, touching on that. But the biggest stock of land that is controlled by government in most cities are the roads. And the roads are almost exclusively given to one thing, and that's to drive cars. And that's where you need to start the change, by how you rethink your roads. You can't have this discussion without explaining the concept of induced demand. There has been proven over and over again throughout the world, if you create more road space by widening a road or building a new one, you actually get more traffic. It doesn't solve it, it makes it worse. The way to make it better is to actually start to increase the investment in the other modes, to make it more public transport, walkable and bikeable. It's a hard decision to have when everyone's used to being able to drive everywhere. But, you know, that's really the true answer to all that.
Terrific. Well, look, I think I'm going to turn over to the Mayor to wrap us up. So, Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Rufus, and thank you to all of the panellists and to the audience for being here as well. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think Greg's comments in the opening that made it very clear that Hobart's growth is upon us, and we do have a very, very short window of opportunity to avoid the mistakes that others have made, and to use the opportunity of this growth to do it Hobart style, to harness that growth towards a really great city, but do it in the way that avoids those mistakes and does it the way that we want to do it here in Hobart. I really loved the message about choice. Choice is really essential, and choice. Great cities have a lot of choice. They have a lot of choice of housing. They have a lot of transport choices. So it's not a matter of an either or. We have to get the balance right. But I think it's fair to say that at the moment, the balance is a bit out of sync in Hobart, because there's the choice of housing on the edges and driving, but there's less investment and policy backing for those other choices. I also love this concept of affordable living. I think that's a really, really important way of starting to see the economics differently. So what do we do next? And the discussion about governance and options for the future, again, was really fascinating from this really fantastic panel. The fact that we don't have a proper Department of Planning in this state yet, having a proper housing and land development corporation can do such really important strategic work, and I know those corporations in other states do that work as well. Ellen mentioned developer contributions, and I understand also where most other states have done a lot more in that space, and just making sure that we're charging the real cost of greenfields development, and also getting that value uplift for the medium density closer to the city. Another point I thought was really interesting is how we sell this idea of gentle density. How do we show people that there is a way to have sensitive urban infill? And again, that's part of that Hobart style. We don't have to have the tall buildings of other capital cities. We can build our density in a much more Hobart-centric, suited to Hobart way. And good design is really fundamental in achieving that. So they were some of the things that I took from the panel, and just wanted to thank all of the fantastic panelists, and also like to thank our Vice-Chancellor Rufus, Professor Rufus Black is our moderator. I wanted to especially thank our guest speaker, Greg Vann, our panelists, Stephen Burgess, Ellen Witte, and Professor Jason Byrne. The good news is that this afternoon's talk will be available as a video and podcast via the university's Island of Ideas website, which is now on your screens. And this City Talk series is going to continue. It's a really important partnership for the City of Hobart and UTAS, discussing these really important issues for our city and thinking about urban design and learning about trends that are happening around the world. It's really important at this time of growth. So I'd strongly encourage you to keep joining our City Talks discussions as they keep happening. And you can also register for the talks so that you hear about them as they're coming up. So thank you everyone for taking part in this evening's event, and wish you good night.